Mr. Chairman, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, fellow members. For those who attended last year's conference, Ingrid gave us a superb keynote address. I hope I can at least come close to that with this morning's address for this, our second conference. Little bit of background. I was born in October 1951, son of a tenant farmer on the outskirts of Wigan in Lancashire, educated at St Elizabeth's Primary School, followed by Rigington and Blackrod Grammar School. My school attendance was far from perfect. Good weather at haymaking and harvest time meant that farming became the priority over school, and no doubt today we would have accumulated a significant fines tally for missed school attendances. Growing up on a farm gave me an early introduction into practical engineering, in that machinery needed mending, building maintenance was a yearly event in advance of the landlord's annual inspection. My first introduction into building was to erect a hay barn using discarded telegraph poles that had to be hand-sawn, drilled, bolted together, including forming a simple roof truss to support corrugated asbestos sheeting. The building still stands today, some 55 years later, but has suffered at the hands of the beast from the east storms, leaving it with a permanent and excessive lien that condemns it to demolition once a new planning consent has been obtained. I attended Bolton Institute of Higher Education, now Bolton University, and graduated in 1974 with an ordinary degree in civil engineering. This was a 4-year sandwich course that gave 2 6-month work periods in the construction industry. The first of these was at BDP, at their then headquarters in Moor Lane, Preston. The second was with the Mersey and Weaver River Authority, that became part of the National Rivers Authority and latterly the Environment Agency. After graduating in 1974, my working life started as a salaried graduate engineer with an established medium-sized Manchester-based consulting civil and structural engineers practice. During the next 8 years, I moved to a larger national practice, and then returned to the original practice, having gained significant new experience. I attained Chartered Engineer and MIStructE status in June 1979. This brought a significant rise in salary with benefits and also an increase in project responsibility. Much of the project work I was involved with at that time related to structures and foundations in heavy manufacturing industry, petrochemical and other forms of specialist process plant installations, either here in the UK or for fabrication here and shipping overseas. Where did it begin? I started Rutter Johnson in November 1982, initially as a partnership with a colleague, but that only lasted 6 months. I then continued as a sole trader. 1982 was nearing the end of a 3-year recession that had significantly affected, or had a significant effect on the country's economy. Interest rates at that time peaked at 18%, with the result that construction project finance was difficult and costly. I recall our house mortgage interest at the time was an eye-watering 14.5%. The medium-sized consultancy practice I was then employed with had a number of projects cancelled or delayed due to financing difficulties. And so the office workload and general morale was very low. I took the opportunity, after speaking with my then senior partner, to resign from his employment and to start my own practice. He was supportive as it reduced his overheads, but he thought I was taking a big risk. I agreed to work as a subcontract engineer for him when required, and for several years I continued to work for them on this basis while continuing to develop my own practice. The senior partner gave me 3 pieces of advice as I left his employment. They were: the only person who never makes a mistake never does any work, so get yourself adequate professional indemnity insurance cover. When you're at your busiest is when you need to be actively looking for the next project or commission. You will need to find the work, complete the work, and get paid for the work, and sometimes getting paid can be the hardest to achieve. I've added 2 further pieces of advice. Never discard your first sketches, notes and proposals. These are often the basis of the final chosen solution. Beware of the curved ball, as you will never see it coming or expect its arrival. He actually gave me a leaving present. This was an early copy of a booklet entitled Plain English, and he added a note to say, "My engineering was sound, but my report writing needed much improvement. This book is still available, and I recommend it to all who are involved in report writing." So with a few £1,000 savings and an overdraft facility of £5,000 at 18% interest, I started along a route that I'm still travelling today. In the early days, getting your name known in the right place is key to finding new commissions. Very often family and friends are useful in spreading the word around. The few contacts that I had developed in my own right were generally small to medium-sized local builders requiring designs for alteration and extension, local steel fabricator who require portal frame design, connection design and the like. At that time, these were all by hand calculation using slide rule or basic calculator and all hand-drawn detailed drawings. Obviously, this move from full-time employment resulted in a significant reduction in monthly income, and in order to support my family, I did part-time lecturing in structural analysis and materials to HNC and HND civil engineering students. This continued for a number of years and was critical in supplementing monthly income. In the very early days, the commissions were fairly small, and I recall thinking that at some point a larger, more lucrative commission would appear. True to form, it did. Through my work with the steel fabricator, I was introduced to a specialist aerial rigger who carried out work in the then rapidly expanding telecommunications industry, and they had been asked to obtain a structural assessment of an existing 220-foot high steel angle lattice tower that had been built in World War II as a radar tracking mast, but with extending side arms that served also as parachute training jump platforms. It was planned to add numerous microwave dishes to the existing lattice mast, but they had concerns about the increased wind load, but more importantly, the increased lateral deflection, as the microwave beam signal had little tolerance between sending and receiving dishes. This I saw as my first big step. The fee I negotiated represented 6 months' salary, so needless to say, I accepted the commission, and the tower was climbed via the 45-year-old timber vertical ladders onto intermediate timber platforms, steel corrosion depths and section sizes checked, bolts removed and checked for corrosion and elongation, and I admit to being totally petrified when at 200 feet I was told by the accompanying experienced rigger that a whirlwind was fast approaching. I should lie down on the platform, strap myself to and hang on tight to the mainmast leg. The mast remains in operation, standing alongside the Humber Bridge, and is laden with aerials and dishes. At that time, structural design software was in its infancy, not readily available other than on mainframe computers. Thus, hand calculation was used for each member, the connections, and the overall lateral deflection. Working with local businesses usually leads on to getting involved with architects, project managers, quantity surveyors, and the like, who often will add your name to their project professionals list for future projects. Looking back over the years, it's quite clear that contacts you make during the very early years move on in their careers, they move companies, attain positions of responsibility, often reaching managerial or directorship posts. These contacts have proved to be a very regular source of new work. The institution's Find an Engineer has also produced a number of new commissions. Usually these are clients who are remote from your locality but need advice from a local engineer. Where will structural engineering take you as a sole or small practitioner? In my experience, it will take you where you're prepared to let it. Many of our leading national and major international engineering consultants started life as small practitioners. My contacts in the industrial sector resulted in undertaking project work in Germany, France and Belgium. This was the most interesting period in my own career, as I worked closely with specialist engineers from Germany, Austria and Italy. It will come as no surprise that language was a particular challenge to a northern lad who was excluded from French classes at school and needed 5 attempts to achieve O-level English language. My wife was always amused during our trips abroad, as she said I had developed the art of conversing in Eurosplatter and could include a little German, French and Italian with a pinch of Spanish in the same sentence. It also took me to Antigua, working with a Jamaican engineer who had trained in the UK and returned to practice in Antigua. This was a particular eye-opener when witnessing their system of driving precast concrete piles. The driving head between hammer and pile top was a piece of thick hardwood, tethered by a string and inserted between each hammer blow by a young guy in flip-flops, shorts and a high-vis waistcoat, whilst hanging off the side lattice cross-member of the piling rig mast. Working with process engineers brought us in contact with specialist incinerator manufacturers, who turned out to be the leading worldwide suppliers of cremators. As a result of this, we recently completed our 8th new build crematorium development. This was a particular challenging development as it involved both new cremator and new cemetery. During the planning stage, the question was raised as to what happens to the decomposition liquor from the graves, as the town relied on the water supply pumped from the chalk beds below. I will leave that thought with you. I had no particular ambition or specific goal other than to earn a living and, more importantly, to be my own boss. The opportunities that have presented themselves and a willingness to give it a go when a new challenge arose has been a most fulfilling and enjoyable career. Over the years, I've met many engineers, some who choose to stay within a particular sector, and others who expand into different sectors so they can offer a wider range of services to their clients. There is no right or wrong with either approach. It is very much an individual choice. Over the first 18 months, workload increased steadily, and I appointed my first full-time member of staff and arranged a 50% share of a rented office with a friend and colleague who was just starting his own software company. I clearly remember having times as a sole practitioner when you missed the benefits of a large design office with reference library and other experienced engineers with whom you can discuss possible engineering solutions. I firmly believe that some form of mentoring and support is a huge benefit for sole and small practitioners. As workload increases, one has a choice to make. Either grow or be selective with the commissions you accept and stay as you are. This is very much a personal choice. We opted to grow as workload increased. This obviously needs a continuous supply of projects and commissions. You will find that some projects, when nearing completion, have articles published in trade magazines and local press. This gives an opportunity for good publicity about your involvement and is very much a bonus when growing your practice. In the early 1990s, we were appointed engineers to a local private school that involved converting the historic listed swimming pool hall into an arts and conferencing centre. A tricky job, particularly as the main contractor went into liquidation midway through the project. On completion in 1993, the late Diana, Princess of Wales, opened the newly created Arts and Conference Centre. This produced some excellent publicity, as we were listed in many of the articles produced. Some years later, I was invited to tea at the House of Lords Terrace as a result of our involvement in this project. If you get the opportunity to use this type of publicity, it may well lead to new commissions. Conversely, bad publicity can soon tarnish your reputation. For example, I recently condemned an unsafe ground floor of a hospital theatre, giving the trust a matter of a few months to find alternative theatre accommodation and to vacate the building pending repair or demolition. This, of course, was reported by the local press with a very negative slant. The reports, however, failed to state that my two previous inspection reports in 2011 and 2013 had forewarned the trust of the rapid deterioration of the floor and had recommended that alternative theatre space needed to be included in their immediate development plans. When growing our practice, we identified three key factors as the practice expanded. These were staffing levels, financing, and premises. Members of staff are our most valuable asset, but are likely to be our biggest headache. Balancing staff levels against workload in itself is a bit of an art. When do you increase staff? There have been times during our growth that we needed additional staff. We found that finding the right staff at short notice is extremely difficult. Although you will be aware that workload is increasing, the point at which you need to have additional resources hangs very much in the balance. It takes a minimum 3 months to advertise, interview, select a suitable candidate, and that is assuming a 1 month notice period for the candidate you select. This can sometimes extend to 6 months if a senior candidate has a 3 months notice period with his current employer. I have no definitive advice as to the optimum time to increase staffing levels. If you're confident that the increased workload will continue, then expand your staff sooner rather than later. If the increased workload is speculative, I would tend to wait for the final confirmation. On occasions, we tried short-term contract staff, but with limited success, as one can spend an inordinate amount of time checking and rechecking their work. This just adds to your own workload. We had a very good working relationship with a number of other local consultants, and by reciprocal agreement, we would enlist their help and vice versa. Obviously, this relies on a good deal of trust and understanding between the two parties, but can be a valuable resource in the short term. Personal experience with recruitment companies has not been the best. We found that they often failed to adequately vet candidates thoroughly, and so one spends time interviewing candidates who were not suitable for the post. By far our most successful staffing originated from employing graduates and youngsters on the previous YTS or youth training scheme. We encouraged and funded continued education for the staff, usually day release or sandwich course, and most of the staff we've employed attained technical or chartered engineering status. Many have reached positions of responsibility in the construction sector as they received good further education and training. Employing staff brings its own unique set of issues. 3 occurrences I recall. A female member of staff in a very unsettled personal relationship was found after office hours in the ladies' toilets having cut her wrists with a razor blade. A junior member of staff who thought having keys and alarm code for the office entitled him to hold a weekend rave party for his friends and many others. This only came to light after I was contacted by the police. A senior member of staff who suffered from a prolonged illness, and even though we had contracts of employment in place that clearly defined up to 12 months sickness provision, it did not cover for a period exceeding 12 months. Unfortunately, this resulted in an employment tribunal hearing. I strongly recommend that you seek your lawyer's advice on your employment contracts, particularly for prolonged sickness. Expansion continued at a steady rate over the next 6 or 7 years until the recession of the late 1990s. This was a short recession, and although it had some effect on the general economy, we were fortunate in having sizable projects that were largely unaffected, and so we were able to trade through this recession. By the mid-1990s, the practice had grown to 18 full-time staff. Obviously, increased staff numbers resulted in a move to larger premises, and the monthly expenditure on staff salaries and office costs has substantially increased. Although this period was our most profitable, it also proved to be my most stressful time, as having sole responsibility, my normal office workday was spent dealing with staff queries and problems, seeking new commissions, and generally trying to keep up with overall management. It soon became clear that I was an engineer first and a businessman very much second. Be mindful that as you increase staff levels in response to workload, your existing staff may already be deciding to leave your employment, particularly if new appointed staff salaries are disproportionate to existing staff remuneration. Our practice is in its 35th year of continuous trading, and we have only 1 year out of 35 when we did not return a profit, albeit some profits were quite modest. Nonetheless, I feel this is quite an achievement. Cash flow is fundamental to continued day-to-day operation. This requires regular fee invoicing and constant chasing payment. Working capital along with cash flow are the two most important factors in keeping the business operational. Banks are usually very willing to offer financial support when times are good. You have a healthy order book. This means that funding a practice expansion is relatively straightforward. When a downturn in workload and fee income occurs, banks become much less accommodating. This is when capital reserves are most beneficial, but obviously these are not limitless. Fee agreements with clients vary greatly and are very much down to individual arrangement. Many large organisations and authorities have very lengthy payment terms. We choose to avoid any terms longer than 60-day payment periods, as this is unsustainable for small practices. We have and continue to refuse work when the payment terms are unsuitable. Where possible, we try and arrange interim fee payments and often require a 10% interim first payment when instructions are issued. This we find is becoming common practice. Bad debts happen, and when it is due to a client going into administration or liquidation, it is effectively a write-off of outstanding monies. Domestic clients can often be the worst bad debts, particularly when properties they propose to buy have serious structural issues, and they consider that as they are not proceeding with the purchase, they see no reason to pay for the structural report. County court judgments usually resolve the matter, but can be lengthy and costly. As mentioned in my advice section, my curved ball arrived early in 1997 after a particularly profitable period. I had relied totally on our accountant, who at the time was considered a family friend and had been involved from the very start. He provided us with financial advice and dealt with our PAYE and tax issues. What was not apparent was that my signed cheques handed to him to complete the reference numbers and then forward as payment to the tax dues never reached the tax authorities but ended up in his private bank account. This came to light when a bailiff arrived at the office with a writ for a very substantial demand owing to the tax authorities. As you can imagine, this was a time of shock, panic and distress. I urgently sought professional advice from two reputable and expensive accounting firms, and their advice was simple: declare yourself bankrupt. I was not prepared to throw away all I had worked for so hard without a fight, and so I opted to ignore this advice and to defend myself in the Royal Courts of Justice. This was a day not to be forgotten, but had a positive outcome. The judge, having listened to my plea, confirmed that my then accountant was already under investigation for a number of similar cases. I was given 3 years to pay arrears, including interest. Shortly afterwards, the accountant was arrested, tried and found guilty and sentenced to 3 years in prison, of which he served 18 months. I admit to still feeling very aggrieved, particularly as he was set free while I was still paying the debts arising from his fraudulent actions. Whilst writing this speech, it occurred to me that in these days of bank transfer and mobile banking, this sort of misappropriation of funds would be most unlikely to happen. However, within days, we received a large payment into our bank that we had not invoiced. It turns out that the payment had arrived with us as a result of human error by a client's accounting staff entering one wrong number in the bank transfer account transaction. We returned the payment within 24 hours. However, I revised my opinion and consider that yes, it is still possible for funds to be directed elsewhere. Be careful when selecting your accountants, financial advisors and admin staff. Two things became highly apparent from this stressful occurrence. Firstly, that you can seek advice from the best of professionals, but you alone have the final decision, and as I did, may choose not to follow their advice. Secondly, the exposure to such a significant financial risk of being a sole trader became very apparent, and as a result, I opted to change status to a limited company due simply to the large personal financial risk. Growing your business and increasing staff numbers will require larger premises, and this needs to be factored into your future planning. Finding the right premises can be tricky and time-consuming. I believe in this day and age, with digital conferencing facilities, digital information exchange, there is no requirement to be based in a city or town location when out-of-town or edge-of-town premises are available at much reduced cost and often come with associated car parking. We are located in shared premises on the perimeter of an industrial estate. However, we use the local hotel for meeting rooms and conferencing, as it provides cost-effective meeting environment with the latest audio-visual equipment, overhead projection, ample car parking and refreshments included in the cost. It's located adjacent to the motorway network junction, close to the railway station with links to the airport. Although we work throughout the UK, we opted to remain at one office location. Remote satellite offices, in my experience, are costly, and you need to be confident that they can be effectively managed on a day-to-day basis. Archiving in the pre-digital age was always a balance of what to keep, how long to keep it, and where to store the reams of paper and drawings. In our previous premises, we had a dry cellar racked out for storage. Unfortunately, a local developer kindly damaged the main water supply pipe on an adjacent development, resulting in the cellar flooding and damaging at least half of our early years archives. We employed a specialist company to retrieve and digitise what could be salvaged, but this was not as successful as we had expected, and much of the digitised material is of little use. After this experience, we archived project files for 12 years. Only selective projects that may have future phases are retained for longer than 12 years. Encouraging staff to back up and archive projects regularly is often a challenge. I strongly recommend that you check from time to time that the archives and backups are readable. Experts recommend having several current backups, with some being stored away from the office for safekeeping. This takes some organising to ensure that you have concurrent backups both on and off-site. Select your professional indemnity insurer with care. Do not just opt for the cheapest quotation. Our current insurers are excellent and continue to be supportive with advice on hand when you need it. It is reassuring to know that you can pick up the telephone and talk through your concerns with a trustworthy advisor. Previous insurers were unable or unwilling to give this level of service and advice. Never assume that you will not receive some form of claim, as when something goes wrong on a project, it is not unusual for all the professionals to be required to defend a claim. When accepting commissions for new projects, some larger authorities have unaffordable and unrealistic PI requirements, that far exceed the value of the work that you're involved in. On numerous occasions, we have turned down commissions when the PI cover requirement is excessive. The level of PI cover you should be offering should be commensurate with the value of the work that you're involved with. When required to provide collateral warranties, try wherever possible to use documents pre-approved by your insurers. A recession. I started this practice at the end of the 1980-82 recession. This was a good time as work was on the increase and enabled us to grow with this increase. We traded through the 1990-92 recession using reserves and being fortunate in that projects in progress were largely unaffected by the downturn. The recession of 2008 dealt us a severe blow to us and many other professionals. We lost about 60% of our annual income when large residential developments were shelved or stopped completely. This resulted in reducing staff from 12 pre-recession to 6 staff within a 12-month period. I kept all the staff regularly informed of the work situation and suggested that if other employment opportunities arose, they would be advised to accept them. Luckily, we did not make any staff redundant. However, working hours were reduced to cut salary costs, and principals took a sizable reduction in remuneration. Experience shows that recessions will reoccur in the future, probably with little pre-warning as to when or the impact it will have on the general economy and in particular the construction sector. Work-life balance. Maintaining a work-life balance is important. In the early days of my work took precedence over everything, including family life and any recreational activities. Time away from the pressures of business is very necessary. It relieves stress, gives you time to gather your thoughts, and often leads to rethinking your plans and ideas. Make some time for activities that give you a complete break from the pressures of daily business life. In my case, I have no interest in sport, so I chose to learn to fly helicopters. This was a complete change from business life and has given me some most memorable experiences, including flying into London Battersea Heliport at 500 feet along the Thames with a view of the city that is quite unique. The final chapter, exiting. During our working life, we are encouraged to make suitable pension provision for our eventual retirement. In our case, individual pensions lost some 45% of their value in a matter of months following the 2008 recession. Our financial advisors forecast that it would take some 10 years to regain the pre-recession value. Unfortunately, this has been an accurate forecast, and they are just reaching their pre-recession value. For principals and directors, your bank and financial advisors will urge you to plan an exit strategy, particularly where there are 2 or more individuals involved. This will lead to a number of cross-insurance policies and a further addition to your monthly outgoings. We had a detailed exit strategy established with all the recommended policies in place. The 2008 recession totally decimated these exit plans. My own partial exit planned for 2010 obviously did not happen. Although this is my final chapter, the book is unfinished and the ending is very much in a state of flux. Unfortunately, my wife died last May, having been diagnosed with motor neurone disease in 2016. This required a change from engineering to a primary carer, then back to engineering. My work-life balance is now very much unbalanced and all future plans on hold. Hopefully today's workshop sessions will give me some guidance on how to complete my final chapter.